The glass turnstiles at the main entrance of Apex Wealth Management always reminded me of a high-security prison for people in expensive suits. They were clean, heavy, and completely unforgiving. On that rainy Tuesday morning, the lobby smelled like wet wool and stale espresso. I walked in, shaking the water from my umbrella, ready to tackle a busy week. I took out my RFID badge, pressed it against the glossy black sensor, and waited for the familiar green flash and the light click of the gate unlocking. Instead, the turnstile let out a long, loud, cold beep. A solid red light flashed in my face. I blinked, thinking it was just a system glitch. I tapped the card again. The machine let out the exact same flat, buzzing rejection sound. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" I looked up. A burly security guard named Frank stepped out from behind the reception desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable. His eyes darted to the floor, avoiding mine. Frank had known me for over a decade. I was the guy who brought him coffee during the holiday shifts and always asked about his family. But right now, his hand was resting near his belt, and his shoulders were tense. "My badge isn't working, Frank," I said, keeping my voice level completely calm. "Must be an IT issue with a new security patch." "It's not an IT issue, Marcus," a voice called out from across the lobby. I turned around. Descending from the sleek glass elevators was my regional VP, Julian Vance. Despite sharing the same last name, we were absolutely not related. It was a cosmic joke that I had to endure every single day. Julian was 45 years old, wore a three-piece suit that cost more than a security guard's monthly salary, and possessed a level of unearned confidence that only nepotism could buy. Walking half a step behind him was Clara from HR, clutching a tablet to her chest like a shield. Julian didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he reached down, picked up a standard cardboard box sitting behind the reception counter, and slid it across the smooth marble desk toward me. Inside were the family photos from my desk, my favorite fountain pen, and a stack of personal notebooks. "You're being let out, Marcus," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake corporate sympathy. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, your employment with Apex Wealth Management has been terminated. Clara has your severance paperwork ready to email." "Terminated?" I asked. I didn't shout. I didn't let my heart rate spike. In the corporate world, the first person to show anger loses. "On what grounds, Julian?" "Performance issues and portfolio stagnation," Julian replied, crossing his arms. It was a blatant, outrageous lie. My name is Marcus Vance. At 42 years old, I had spent the last 12 years of my life building the single most valuable asset in this entire firm, a $47 million institutional client portfolio. I managed the legacy accounts for the biggest logistics, energy, and tech conglomerates in the region. My portfolio wasn't stagnating. It was up 14% this quarter alone. But I knew exactly what was actually happening. 3 months ago, Julian had forced the firm to hire his 28-year-old nephew, Brad. Brad was a lazy, entitled Ivy League graduate who spent his days looking at sports cars online while drowning in basic asset allocation tasks. Julian was cutting me out so he could hand my entire $47 million portfolio directly to his nephew, securing Brad's fast-track promotion to partner. Julian sneered, leaning in close. "Don't make a scene, Marcus. Walk away quietly. The clients belong to Apex Wealth, not you. Your network access has been permanently severed. You're done." What Julian and the HR department completely forgot, however, was a foundational clause in my original partnership agreement from 10 years ago. My contract contained a highly specific, ironclad rider called the Material Account Breach Protection Clause. The moment the firm unilaterally revoked my operational access to these specific legacy clients without a 30-day written notice or proven criminal cause, it automatically triggered an immediate, irreversible legal lockout. The firm's proprietary CRM system would instantly encrypt the client communication histories, and the accounts would be legally frozen in a regulatory holding pattern. Julian thought he just stole my life's work. In reality, he had just pulled the pin on a massive corporate grenade, and he was standing right on top of it. I carried my cardboard box out of the lobby, walking with a steady, unhurried pace. I didn't look back. I stepped out into the gray, pouring rain, unlocked my sedan, and placed the box carefully on the passenger seat. I sat behind the steering wheel, adjusted my rearview mirror, and looked across the street at the towering high-rise of Apex Wealth Management. I was completely, utterly calm. Suddenly, my personal phone began to vibrate in my pocket. One by one, automated email alerts began rolling in on my private screen. The system was working exactly as designed. I looked at those alerts and smiled. To understand why Julian's move was so completely catastrophic, you have to understand how I built this invisible empire. 10 years ago, Apex Wealth was a struggling, mid-market firm operating out of a cramped office with outdated tech. The founding partners were desperate for capital and institutional credibility. I was a rising star at a major global bank, and I possessed something they desperately needed: deep, personal relationships with major corporate founders. When I agreed to jump ship and join Apex, I single-handedly brought over the Vanguard Logistics Group, the Apex Energy Trust, and the Omnitech Endowment. But I wasn't naive. I knew the corporate world was crawling with sharks, corporate climbers, and lazy executives who loved to sit in air-conditioned offices and exploit the hard work of actual operators. Because the firm was desperate for my clients, my legal team forced their founding partners to sign a highly non-standard, aggressive contract. Julian had joined the company only 3 years ago through a nepotistic connection on the board of directors. He was all flash, expensive watches, and meaningless corporate buzzwords, but he had absolutely zero understanding of actual asset management or the deep legal architecture of our legacy accounts. For the past 6 months, I had noticed him subtly forcing his nephew Brad into my quarterly client reviews, insisting that the young man needs to learn from the best. Brad was a nightmare. He would show up late, scroll through his phone during high-stakes presentations, and then copy my weekly market analysis reports word for word, emailing them to senior leadership as if he had written them himself. I realize now that Julian had been planning this ambush for a very long time. He waited for the Q2 compliance cycle to officially close this week, so they could point to the portfolio's recent 14% growth and claim it was the result of Brad's new digital strategy. They assumed I would react like every other mid-level executive. They thought I would slide into a deep depression, hire a cheap strip mall lawyer, and spend 6 months begging for a slightly larger severance package. They had no idea that my clients didn't care about the shiny Apex logo on the wall. They didn't trust Apex Wealth. They trusted Marcus Vance. By cutting my badge access at the turnstile this morning, Julian thought he was executing a clean, modern corporate execution. He didn't realize that under the strict keyman clauses embedded in the actual client mandates, revoking my physical access legally severed the firm's right to manage a single dime of those assets. The $47 million was now completely detached from their control, floating in a legal vacuum. I started the car, put it in drive, and pulled away from the curb. It was time to visit my lawyer. By 11 a.m., I was sitting in a high-backed leather chair inside the quiet, wood-paneled office of my longtime employment attorney, Arthur Pendleton. The room smelled of old paper, leather binders, and expensive cologne. Arthur was 65 years old, possessed a sharp, brilliant mind for contract law, and had spent 40 years watching arrogant executives trip over their own shoelaces. I sat across from him, completely relaxed, placing my termination paperwork and a dusty copy of my original 2016 partnership agreement on his glass desk. Arthur adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses, slowly scanning the dense pages. As his eyes hit the material account breach protection rider on page 14, a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a soft, knowing laugh. "Marcus," he said, tapping the document with his fountain pen. "They actually did it. They cut your physical badge access without issuing the mandatory 30-day written notice of account transition." "They did," I replied, taking a slow sip of the cold water his assistant had brought me. Julian wanted me out of the building before the markets opened so Brad could sit at my desk and pretend to be a big shot. "Then it's official," Arthur said, his voice tightening with professional satisfaction. "The automatic legal lockout has successfully engaged. The system is entirely locked down." He turned his computer monitor around to show me the automated compliance dashboard. At the exact millisecond my RFID badge registered a red light at the corporate turnstiles, an encrypted, automated compliance ping was fired out. It didn't just go to the internal compliance server at Apex Wealth. Because my portfolio involves multi-state energy trusts and regulated tech endowments, the signal was simultaneously routed directly to the Federal Regulatory Clearinghouse. Under the strict terms of our investor protection bylaws, any sudden, unnotified change in the designated senior account manager triggers an immediate emergency freeze. It is a protective digital shield designed by the government to prevent insider trading, asset flight, and corporate identity theft during sudden staff disruptions. While I was sitting in Arthur's quiet office, a very different scene was playing out back at Apex headquarters. On the 42nd floor, Julian was likely walking his nephew Brad over to my old corner office. He was probably patting him on the back, telling him to log into the main server and look at his new $47 million kingdom. But the moment Brad typed his new credentials into the Vanguard Logistics account, he wouldn't see spreadsheets or client balances. Instead, he would be staring at a flashing blue screen demanding a master compliance key that only I possessed. The proprietary CRM system had automatically locked down all trading capabilities, asset rebalancing tools, and historical client communication logs for every single one of my accounts. Julian likely thought it was just a temporary IT glitch. I could almost picture him screaming at some terrified 20-something tech support worker in a basement, demanding that they override the system immediately. What his arrogant mind couldn't comprehend was that the internal IT department was entirely powerless. You cannot override a federal regulatory clearinghouse freeze from an internal help desk. Arthur pulled up a fresh document on his screen and began typing with practice speed. He was drafting a formal notice of material breach and enforced asset segregation. It was a cold, brutal legal document detailing how the firm had violated its own partnership bylaws and put $47 million of client capital at immediate operational risk. I am sending this directly to Elena Vance, the Chief Compliance Officer, Arthur said, hitting the print key. We are completely bypassing Julian. Let's see how the executive board reacts when they realize their star vice president just blinded the company's most profitable accounts. It was exactly 2 p.m. when the corporate machine truly began to grind to a halt. I was sitting in a quiet corner booth of a small cafe down the street from the high-rise, watching the rain stream down the large glass windows. I ordered a black coffee and placed my personal phone flat on the darkwood table. I didn't have to wait long. The phone began to vibrate, its buzzing sound echoing against the porcelain cup. The screen displayed a name that would make any executive at Apex Wealth break out into a cold sweat: Thomas Sterling. Thomas was the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a man who had built a global shipping empire from nothing. He was famously short-tempered and completely despised corporate incompetence. I picked up the phone on the third ring. "Marcus," Thomas barked, cutting right through any polite pleasantries. "What the hell is going on over at Apex? I just called your office line to execute a routine $4 million capital transfer for an overseas shipping acquisition. Some stuttering kid named Brad answered your phone. Did he assist you, Thomas?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly smooth and professional. "Assist me?" Thomas snorted. The kid sounded like he was about to cry. He told me there was a minor system migration issue and that my account balance was temporarily unavailable for viewing. I asked to speak with you, and he muttered something about you being out of the office indefinitely. I smelled a rat instantly. "Where are you?" I took a slow breath, letting the silence hang for just a moment to emphasize the weight of my next words. "Thomas, Apex Wealth revoked my building access this morning. Julian Vance terminated my contract without notice because he wants to hand my portfolio to his nephew Brad. Per our original agreement, your accounts are currently under a protective regulatory lockout until a formal inquiry can be made." The line went completely dead. For 5 long seconds, there was absolute silence. When Thomas spoke again, his voice had turned from hot anger into pure, sub-zero ice. "They fired you? And they gave my logistics trust to an untrained child who can't even access my capital during an acquisition window?" "That is correct," I said. They believe the clients belong to the logo, not the advisor. I don't know who Julian is, and I don't care about Apex Wealth, Thomas whispered, his voice deadly calm. My money stays where Marcus Vance is. Period. Within the next 30 minutes, my phone vibrated twice more. First, it was the CEO of Apex Energy, then the director of the Omnitech Endowment. Both had received vague, panicked, automated emails from Brad's newly assigned assistant, trying to schedule reintroduction meetings. Both CEOs were furious that their financial dashboards were showing zeroed-out data due to the compliance freeze. I gave all three clients the exact same clear instructions. Maintain absolute silence, I told them. Do not argue with Julian. Instead, have your corporate legal teams formally request an emergency hearing with the Apex Board of Directors for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Tell them you need to discuss immediate account stability. Julian thought he had just inherited a gold mine that would cement his family's legacy. He had no idea he had actually just inherited a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from three of the most powerful corporate leaders in the state. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and smiled. While the ground was actively shifting beneath his feet, Julian Vance was operating under total, blissful delusion. He had no idea that his brilliant plan was already falling apart. Around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, my personal phone lit up with a text message from Sarah, a sympathetic former colleague who worked in the marketing department on the 42nd floor. She sent me a screenshot of an internal company calendar invite that made me shake my head in pure disbelief. Julian had officially booked the Grand Executive Boardroom for 9 a.m. the next morning. The invitation hadn't just been sent to a few mid-level managers. He had sent it to the managing partners, the chief financial officer, and the chief executive officer himself, Arthur Sterling. The title of the meeting was written in bold, celebratory letters: Strategic Account Optimization and Portfolio Transition Presentation. Julian had framed my sudden, unceremonious firing as a masterclass in modern corporate management. According to Sarah's texts, he was telling anyone who would listen that I was an overpaid, old-school relic who was actively holding back the firm's most valuable assets from digital expansion. Julian was so completely blinded by his own narcissism and his desperate desire to see his family bloodline rise within the firm that he committed the ultimate corporate sin. He completely ignored his own defense mechanisms. Earlier that afternoon, the compliance department's automated tracking system had generated 3 high-priority, red flag warning emails. They were delivered straight to Julian's inbox, explicitly warning him that the legacy portfolio was experiencing an unresolved systemic access blockage. But Julian didn't bother to read them. He assumed those automated pings were just routine IT red tape, small technical glitches that his administrative assistants could clean up by Friday afternoon. He was too busy planning his victory speech. Meanwhile, his nephew Brad was spending his afternoon living out a corporate fantasy. Sarah told me Brad had already contacted the building facilities team to order a frosted glass nameplate for my corner office. He had even submitted an expedited request to the company printing press for custom embossed business cards. His new, unearned title was proudly displayed under his name, Senior Managing Partner of Institutional Accounts. They were both so absolutely certain of their victory that they hadn't bothered to check the foundational legal structure of the accounts they were trying to steal. They didn't realize that the automated lockout rider wasn't just a passive wall. It was an active trap. Every single time Brad sat at his desk and eagerly clicked the admin override button to force his way into my client files, the secure system recorded it. The federal compliance server was quietly building a massive digital audit trail. It flagged each and every click as an unauthorized, black hat cybersecurity breach of protected institutional data. Julian wasn't just failing to manage my portfolio. He was actively allowing his nephew to build a federal evidence file that would permanently destroy both of their careers. And the best part was they were doing it with proud, confident smiles on their faces, completely unaware of the clock ticking down. They thought they were climbing the corporate ladder, but they were actually walking straight off a cliff. The next morning arrived with a heavy, thick fog that rolled across the city skyscrapers, swallowing the top floors of the Apex building. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., feeling entirely rested. I took my time getting ready. I picked out my finest bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and tied my dark silk tie with absolute, steady precision. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look like a disgruntled, fired worker. I looked like an existential threat to an entire corporation. At exactly 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Julian's celebratory meeting was scheduled to begin, the reality of the situation finally hit the upper levels of Apex Wealth Management. Elena Vance, the brilliant and notoriously strict chief compliance officer, had arrived early to review the morning's regulatory reports. Despite sharing a last name with Julian and me, she was completely independent, and she took her job very seriously. When she opened her terminal, her face must have turned completely pale. The automated notices sent by my attorney, Arthur Pendleton, were sitting at the very top of her queue. She looked at the system logs and saw the horror show. Over 40 separate unauthorized security breaches triggered by Brad's login credentials in less than 24 hours. Worse, her assistant handed her 3 urgent, formal letters that had just arrived via courier. They were emergency intervention demands from the legal teams of Vanguard Logistics, Apex Energy, and the Omnitech Endowment. Elena didn't even catch her breath or grab her morning coffee. She grabbed her laptop, sprinted down the long, carpeted hallway of the executive floor, and pushed open the heavy double doors of the grand boardroom. Inside, the atmosphere was festive. Julian and Brad were standing at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table, pouring expensive champagne into crystal flutes for the managing partners and CEO Arthur Sterling. Julian was in the absolute middle of an arrogant speech. He was talking loudly about trimming the executive fat, eliminating legacy bottlenecks, and introducing young, aggressive Ivy League talent to the firm's most valuable clients. Brad stood beside him, grinning like he had just won a marathon he hadn't even run. Elena didn't wait for him to finish. She marched straight to the head of the table and slammed her laptop down onto the mahogany surface, cutting Julian off mid-sentence. "Julian, shut up and sit down," she snapped, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and absolute panic. Before Julian could sputter a response about proper boardroom respect, Elena connected her laptop to the massive central projector screen. The cheerful corporate slides Julian had prepared were instantly wiped away, replaced by a wall of bright red compliance alerts, security breach logs, and federal freeze notices. She turned to face the CEO, Arthur Sterling, completely ignoring Julian. "Marcus Vance's portfolio hasn't been optimized, Arthur," Elena said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "It's completely dead. The entire $47 million is locked in a federal compliance freeze, and we are currently staring down the barrel of a $50 million systemic breach lawsuit from his clients." The champagne glasses were slowly set down onto the table. The room went absolutely, terrifyingly quiet. The smug, arrogant grin on Julian's face instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He stumbled backward slightly, stammering that it was just a minor protocol issue, a simple IT delay that Brad was handling. Right on cue, the heavy boardroom doors clicked open. The burly security guard who had coldly locked me out the day before stepped inside, but he wasn't there to remove anyone. He stood aside, holding the door wide open for the people arriving behind him. I stepped through the heavy double doors of the boardroom, my leather shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. Walking right beside me was my attorney, Arthur Pendleton, and immediately behind him was Thomas Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Logistics. The shock on Julian Vance's face was worth every hour of hard work I gave this ungrateful company over the last 12 years. His jaw dropped. His face turned from a pale white to a deep, angry red. He looked like he had just seen a ghost walking into his victory party. For a second, nobody spoke. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the faint hum of the projector. Then, Julian tried to salvage his pride. He slammed his champagne glass onto the mahogany table, spilling the sparkling liquid across his neatly printed presentation slides. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest, and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Marcus, Julian shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "You are a terminated employee. You have absolutely no right to be on this floor, let alone in this boardroom. Security, have this man removed from the building immediately." He looked around the room, expecting the managing partners or the security guard to back him up. But nobody moved. Instead, the firm's chief executive officer, Arthur Sterling, slowly raised his hand. It was a single, cold gesture that silenced Julian instantly. The CEO didn't look at Julian. He looked directly at Thomas Sterling, the billionaire standing right behind me. "Julian, sit down and be quiet," the CEO said, his voice flat and dangerous. Thomas Sterling stepped forward, completely ignoring Julian as if the man were made of glass. He walked to the center of the massive table and dropped a thick blue-bound legal document right in front of the CEO. The heavy paper hit the polished mahogany with a loud, definitive thud. "Arthur," Thomas said, addressing the CEO directly, "I'm going to make this incredibly simple for you and your board. If Marcus Vance is not personally running my portfolio, Vanguard Logistics terminates its relationship with Apex Wealth effective immediately. And because your regional vice president violated the strict key man clause by cutting Marcus's network access without our prior written consent, we are officially invoking the $10 million immediate withdrawal penalty clause." Before the CEO could process that blow, the boardroom doors opened again. The CEOs of Apex Energy and the Omnitech Endowment stepped inside, flanked by their lawyers, dropping identical legal demands onto the table. Combined, they were preparing to pull all $47 million out of Apex Wealth Management within the next 24 hours. On top of that, they were presenting a massive, joint public lawsuit for a total breach of fiduciary duty, which is the strict legal obligation to act in the best financial interest of the clients. Across the table, Brad was visibly shaking. He looked down at the custom-embossed business cards he had ordered an hour ago, his hands trembling so badly he dropped them. Julian was sweating through his expensive three-piece suit. In a desperate, final attempt to save himself, he looked at the board and began to spin a wild lie. "This is sabotage," Julian stammered, pointing at me. "Marcus knew he was being let go, so he sabotaged our internal network before he left. He deliberately locked the accounts to hurt the firm." My attorney, Arthur Pendleton, calmly stepped forward and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a printed copy of the Federal Cybersecurity Audit Trail and slid it across the table. "Actually, Julian, the logs show that the only people attempting unauthorized, forced access using admin overrides were you and your nephew, Brad. And you did it hours after Marcus's badge was already deactivated. You locked yourselves out." The truth was laid bare in front of the entire executive board. Julian had tried to orchestrate a sloppy, nepotistic coup to steal a senior director's life work, and in doing so, he had legally handcuffed the firm and completely alienated their three largest clients. The cleanup was swift, cold, and devastating. CEO Arthur Sterling closed the compliance file on his laptop. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked disgusted. He turned his eyes toward Julian and Brad, who were both standing frozen at the end of the table. "Julian, Brad, pack your things immediately," the CEO said, his voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. "You are both terminated effective immediately for gross negligence and willful misconduct." This ensured neither received a penny of severance. Worse, that black mark went permanently onto their regulatory records, meaning they would never work in wealth management again. Brad looked like he was going to vomit, and Julian silently slumped into his chair, his corporate empire completely ruined. They were escorted out by the same security guard who had locked me out the day before. Once the doors closed, the atmosphere shifted. The CEO turned to face me, looking completely desperate. He knew that if I walked out today, $47 million and the firm's reputation would leave with me. "Marcus," the CEO said, forcing an apologetic smile. "This was a terrible misunderstanding. Julian acted entirely without our approval. We want to offer your old job back immediately with a 20% raise and a full corporate apology." I looked at the corporate leaders sitting around the table. I smiled calmly and shook my head. "I'm not coming back as an employee, Arthur," I said, my voice steady and firm. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a fresh counterproposal that my attorney and I had drafted late last night, and slid it across the polished mahogany. "I will return only under these exact terms," I explained. "I return as a senior equity partner with a permanent, voting seat on the board of directors. Furthermore, I demand a full 35% equity split of all institutional revenue generated by this firm moving forward." The room went dead silent. It was an aggressive demand, but I held all the leverage. "If you refuse," I continued, looking the CEO dead in the eye, "my clients walk out the door with me right now. My legal team already has the paperwork completed to launch our own independent, private wealth firm by Monday morning." If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected. The CEO looked at the documents, then at the three billionaire clients standing behind me. He had no choice. He took out his pen and signed the agreement right there on the mahogany table. A few minutes later, I went down to get my new executive master badge programmed. Walking past the front glass doors, I saw Julian and Brad standing on the sidewalk in the pouring rain. They were holding their damp cardboard boxes, waiting for an Uber, looking completely defeated. Julian looked up and caught my eye, his face filled with absolute ruin. I didn't say a single word to him. I just stepped inside, tapped my new master badge against the turnstile sensor, and watched the light flash a bright, steady green as the gates swung open. I built this empire with silence and strategy, and today, the corporate world learned exactly what happens when you try to lock out the man who owns the foundation.